Right, for more, let's bring in African Affairs Analyst, Advocate Simpho Mantula. A very good evening to you, Advocate. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, former President Mbeki emphasized that the need for more support for the DRC is a necessity. From your perspective, what do you think the real obstacles are preventing sustained peace in that country beyond what's often reported?
Good evening, Mpo, and Jumbo Africa to your viewers. Mpo, a very important meeting of minds that took place for almost 4 days. You will recall, Mpo, that the question of DRC was navigated, or it was interpreted and was understood from its independence in 1960, Mpo, that since DRC got its independence in 1960 and the killing of Lumumba, it never had any peaceful and a transitional governance. If we look at the challenges of DRC, it is not only a question of the external forces, but it is also internal challenges. You look at ethnicity, you look at the drivers of the conflict in that country for being natural resources. And also we looked at the question of sustained peace. It is beginning with the people of DRC. They were commending Sun City 1, that when South Africa convened the Sun City talks in 2001, they might want to go back to that strategy of Sun City 2, but they were talking about the question of morality, the question of ethics, the question of commitment. But also, I think if we don't resolve the DRC, this continent will never see the light of peace or justice, because what is key is that the DRC, it is surrounded by more than 9 countries. So the sustained peace and durable peace of the DRC, it will definitely impact the neighboring countries. Hence, it is important that we don't lose our focus in finding peace in the DRC. Hence, this meeting invited also the government of DRC, which they didn't want to attend. It also had a Rwandan High Commissioner who had to give his submission about what will be the role of Rwanda in the peace process in the Eastern DRC.
Advocate, how do you think one should begin to reconcile the rhetoric of African solutions to African problems with the ongoing dependence on external mediation and funding in conflict zones like the DRC?
Absolutely, but that aspect was touched on. How do we deal with external mediators and the question of funding our own initiatives? Remember that this peace and security dialogue, it is not an academic process. It is more of what I will call a natural engagement of the non-state actors and the state actors. Hence, the question of Sudan was looked into, the crisis in the Sahel, the question of the Eastern DRC, and also, I think there is a simmering conflict also that we see in the Horn of Africa between Ethiopia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt around the waters. So the question of understanding even the new actors in the conflict zone is very important. We talk about mediation, but we cannot deny that the crisis that we saw in Sudan and DRC, we see the interest of the Arabs, like the Qatar and Doha process. We see the Washington, the US having interest in this conflict mediation processes. But we know, it's one for 2 reasons. There is an issue of the national interest, the national priorities, but we emphasized on that Africa must begin to protect its natural resources, because people come under the pretext of mediating conflicts in Africa only to find out that they are looking for the natural resources. Hence, we find DRC at this state that we have a conflict going on and people suffering, women and children, but companies are thriving. They are making their dividends in those areas. And that's where we looked at the question of the peace fund that is in the UN, the peace fund that is at the AU level and at the SADC. It must be strengthened so that African countries must start to fund their own initiatives. And training of mediators is one thing that was emphasized. How do we train mediators, both women and youth, and our senior diplomats and former heads of state? Hence, in this meeting, you had the former president of Mozambique, Joaquim Albertino Chissano, you had the former prime minister of Mauritius, and also the role of former President Thabo Mbeki, as he has mediated some of these conflicts before. So you'll find that you have that aspect important to say, how do you build the new generation of mediators, and how you do become consistent in also implementing some of this peace agreement, because you can have peace agreements. But we looked at DRC, they had more than 12 agreements, but none of them have passed that test or that light of bringing durable peace in the Eastern Congo region.
As you make mention of SADC and the AU, what role do you think these bodies should be playing in holding member states accountable when they are, in fact, perhaps complicit in fueling conflicts, whether it's directly or through inaction?
We looked at the AU peace architect that maybe is no longer fit for purpose. We need to reboot and review the Africa peace and security architect in terms of the early warning. We looked at the SADC, the regional economic body. There was one point that when I said next year it will be the chairpersonship of South Africa, but also the organ on politics, security and defense. How do we review its role? And the issue of looking security beyond regime, the human security element. Security is changing its face in Paul. You have issues of food security, climate change, you have issues of energy security, you have issues that are now moving towards how do we understand also the role of the intervention forces. Do we have intervention and the peace support forces, or do we have also the intervention that is able to deal with the conflict in the DRC? So we looked at the AU, the East Africa Community, and the SADC that have also agreed to work together towards resolving the conflict in the Eastern DRC under the guidance of the AU. You will recall that we see that Washington is moving at a fast pace in dealing with the Eastern DRC question, but we still need to say the SADC has a role to play. If you look at the conflict of Mozambique, we know how this conflict ended up being dealt by Rwanda as well as EU, but it was also the mandate of the SADC community to support the people of Mozambique. You look at the Horn of Africa, the role of IGAD, the role of AU, how they should have assisted the two Sudans. We have a conflict that has been going on in Sudan since 2023 and the conflict in the South Sudan since 2013. So that's how I still feel that the issue is to reboot, is to review, is to have institutions that are fit for purpose and they can respond to the agency and the emergency of African conflicts.
Very well. Thank you so much, Advocate Simpho Mantula, who is an African affairs analyst, giving us some some of the factors that came out of the African Peace and Security Dialogue in Magaliesburg.